Great is thy faithfulness. Well, good evening. Good to see everybody. Hope you've had a blessed day. We were singing that song a few minutes ago, Marvelous Grace of Our Loving Lord. I know I've probably told you this, but every time I sing that song now, I remember the morning when I went forward and made public my calling to ministry. And that was the song that our church was singing. And so every time I sing that song now, I relive that morning. And that's been, let's see, how many years ago? It's been a few. But it's still very evident in my mind. It is good to see you. Glad that you're with us. Those are online. And so if you take your Bibles, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 4. So we're finishing up Ruth this evening. And I'm sure you probably would like to know what we're going to go to next. And my answer is, I don't know. Haven't figured that out yet. I got a few things in mind. I got a couple of series. I was going through some old sermon notes from past years and some things that I haven't used in a while, and so I may actually do that, because what we've got to do is try to have something that's going to be about 8 weeks long to get us through February and into through March, because once we get to April is when I'm anticipating us getting started in our study of Revelation. So don't want to get into something that's going to be too terribly extended. So I'm working on it, and I'll give you a surprise next week and let you know what it is. All right? Okay, so Ruth chapter number 4. So as we get into the book of Ruth this evening, got to do a little bit of summarizing of what we've covered up until this point. So remember in Ruth chapter number 1, we have the account. What happened in Ruth chapter 1? Y'all help me. Y'all participate in this. What happened in chapter 1? All right, there's a famine, and that meant that what happened? Yeah. Elimelech and his family, Naomi, his sons, went to Moab. All right? So they get to Moab, and within a couple of years, Elimelech dies. And so Naomi is a widow. During that time, her sons had married, but over the course of the next 10 years or so, her 2 sons die. And so she is then left with 2 daughters-in-law who are also widowed. So she hears that things have improved in Bethlehem and back home in Israel and Judah. And so she decides to go back home. And both daughter-in-laws decided that they were going to go with her. But she talks to them and says, look, you really need to think this through. And so one of them decides to stay in Moab, but Ruth decides to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem. And it was that period of time, and one thing I wanted to go back and kind of review is it was during that Ruth spoke those words that, as I said, even today they're used oftentimes in marriage ceremonies. And before I read this, though, you can't help but to realize that even though Naomi was heartbroken, it had been a bitter experience in Moab and so forth, there had to have been something about her and her faith to have had such an impact on Ruth. Because Ruth makes this statement to Naomi. She says, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. So there had to still be something about Naomi that really had made that kind of an impression on Ruth. So they make their way back to Bethlehem, and people realize that, hey, Naomi's back, and everybody's welcoming her and so forth. So we come to the end of chapter 1. We get to chapter number 2. And so here's Naomi and Ruth. They're in Bethlehem. Really don't have any resources, so to speak. So Ruth says, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to find a field where the owner, a man, will let me glean some of the barley. And so she goes out and she sees the field. She goes to that field, asks for permission, and they said, yes, you can glean. And of course, we've talked about how The Jewish law provided that the corners of the fields would not have been harvested. If something got spilled, it was left on the ground, and that was for the poor. And so, come to find out, this is the field owned by Boaz. And as Boaz comes in, he happens to take note of that, hey, there's this new young woman. Who is this? And so they began to explain to him, this is Ruth, who came back with Naomi, and she's really taking care of Naomi, blah, blah, blah. And he goes to her and shows her favor, takes her home and feeds her, sends her home. She came empty-handed and sends her home with like 40 pounds of barley, okay? Then we come to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, if you remember, it starts out and Naomi is saying, and Naomi knows she's up in years, but she wants to make sure Ruth is taken care of. So she says, here's what you do. Boaz is a close relative. And we've talked about how that terminology means the idea of Goel, the kinsman redeemer. And she says, here's what I want you to do. You go down to the threshing floor where he has been winnowing and sifting and cleaning the chaff from the barley and the wheat and so forth. After he lies down and goes to sleep, you lie down at his feet. And when he awakes, you tell him basically that you want him to be your redeemer, your kinsman redeemer, and that if he would be willing to do so, you'll be willing to be his wife. She does that, but then he says, I'm game, right? But there's one problem. There's a closer kinsman than me. I have to deal with that first before we can do anything. So that brings us to chapter number 4. So you notice the very first thing we have in our outline says Boaz speaks with the other kinsman, okay? So chapter 1 begins like this. It says, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. Now, a couple of things we want to talk about. So the question is this. What is the significance that he went to the gate? What is the significance of that? Do what? Okay, that plays into it. Why was the gate such an important thing? If you've read the Old Testament, yeah, even in the New Testament, the gate of the city is where businessmen gathered, highly respected men gathered. You kind of think of it like this. It's sort of like where the city council gathered. Okay? It could also serve as somewhat of a courtroom. It was a place where you could get counsel on certain issues and so forth. Or if you had a legal matter to be addressed, or if you had a business transaction that needed to take place, you were in a place where you had plenty of witnesses and they were credible witnesses. And so he goes there knowing very well that there was a good chance that this other relative who has prerogative above Boaz in being the redeemer for Naomi and Ruth, he knows likely that he's going to be there. And sure enough, he comes by, okay? So we begin further in verse number 1. It says, so Boaz said, come aside, friend, and sit down here. In other words, we need to talk. We got some business that we need to take care of. So he came aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders, that is Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And so they sat down, and then he said to the close relative, and I got to interject something right here because this is really a very skillful way in which Boaz handles this, all right? He's being straight up, but he's also being strategic. Yeah, he's being clever in how he presents this, all right? Because in many instances, a kinsman redeemer might have a relative interest in what's going on and so forth, but not likely an emotional interest, okay? Well, Boaz has an emotional interest here, all right? Let's even say a romantic interest here. So he's very wise about how he handles this thing and how he presents it. So he said to the close relative in verse 3, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now that's information that we've not been given to date. So they had land, but apparently probably at some point after they had gotten back to Bethlehem, because she and Ruth are basically impoverished, all right? So she has sold this piece of land. Well, in Jewish culture, when you had a piece of land that belonged to a Jewish man, a Jewish family, and it had to be sold, that was one of the last things you wanted to happen. Because the idea was keeping this stuff in and it being passed on from generation to generation. So that's one way in which the kinsman redeemer comes into play. Because she had sold this piece of land, but a kinsman redeemer has the prerogative of going to the person who bought that piece of land and saying, I'm buying this back from you. Now, he would have to give him what he paid for it. But I'm buying this back from you to put it back into the family so that it is not lost to the family. All right? So she has sold the piece of land. Verse 4, he says, and I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. So in other words, Boaz is saying, look, you and I have to make a decision. One of us have a responsibility here. You are the kinsman redeemer who has the prerogative here. You have the priority of choice. You need to decide, are you going to do this? If you're going to, fine. If you're not, then I will. So it goes on to the end of verse number 4 says, and he said, that is this other kinsman, I will redeem it. So Boaz presents the first matter in this case is the matter of this land that has been sold and that needs to be redeemed. And the other Goel, the other kinsman, he's interested in this piece of land. Because here's his thinking. Now, he's a businessman. Both these guys are businessmen. So this other Goel, here's his thinking. Okay, Naomi sold this piece of land. Her husband's dead. Her sons are dead. She is beyond childbearing age, so he knows he's not going to have to enter into what was known as a levirate marriage, which is where a kinsman redeemer would marry the widow of a fellow Jew, a brother Jew who has died, would have a child with her. The kinsman redeemer would be the biological father, but legally and by name, the child would be the child of the deceased brother, okay? But this guy's thinking, okay, husband's dead, Naomi's too old to have children, she has no sons, I'll put the money out to buy this, it'll be Naomi's while she lives, but when she dies, it's mine. That's his thinking, okay? So that's the reason why he says, I'll buy it. So Boaz has laid out before him the first piece of this matter, and that is the matter of the land. But Boaz has a card up his sleeve, all right? Verse 5. Then Boaz said, okay, here's the second matter. On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, or a better translation is, you must take as your wife Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. Yes, Naomi's husband is dead, and yes, her two sons are dead, but one of her daughters-in-law is still alive, and she's with me. And she's in this equation here. And so as the kinsman, he has the responsibility of taking up this levirate marriage that I just described a moment ago and having a child with Ruth, who is biologically his, but is legally by name and by inheritance the son of the deceased. Which means that if he buys the land, it's going to be Naomi's, and then it's going to become Ruth's, and if they have this child together, it's going to be the child's, and the child gets the land and the money that he expended to get it. Okay? Verse 6, and the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. He doesn't want to go there because he sees that the money he's going to have to outlay for this purchase of land to bring it back isn't going to be coming back to him. And so he passes on that, all right? And however, now I said, this was a clever piece of orchestration on the part of Boaz, okay? But here's the thing. Everything that I just described that would have transpired with this other kinsman, in that he would have to enter into this levirate marriage, father a child by Ruth, biologically his, but legally the son of the deceased, who ultimately will end up with the land, and the money that has been laid out to get it will never come back to him. Boaz has to do the same thing. But Boaz don't care, because Boaz is in love. It's amazing how love will make you have a different perspective on things, doesn't it? Make a good show. Yeah, love is blind, yeah. So Boaz concludes the conversation there, and he's got the witnesses, and the witnesses are still there. So verses 7 through 10, we come to the confirmation of their agreement. Verse 7, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Verse 8, therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, all right, you buy the land. And so he took off his sandal, that is, this other kinsman takes off his sandal, and Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Kelion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. So the other kinsman takes his sandal off and hands it to Boaz. And the gesture is saying this prerogative and this deal is no longer under my foot. It is now yours. And so he gives him his sandal as validation of that in the presence of the witnesses. He came to the gate with one shoe, two shoes on. He goes back with one shoe on and one shoe off. Unless somebody had a spare. Verse 10, he goes on and says, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. And so there again, all of this has been transacted. They're at the gate, and it's all official, and there are plenty of witnesses there, and so that's why it takes place at the gate. Now, so here's something. So you just notice what happens. So there are these 10 men that are asked to be the witnesses, but there are more people gathered around there. And so there's an interesting thing that happens here, that as Boaz makes this announcement, okay, I'm taking on the responsibility of the kinsman. I'm taking Ruth to be my wife and to raise up a son to carry on the name of her deceased husband and so forth. And it says in verses 11 and 12, talks about how the people rejoice. Verse 11 says, and all the people who are at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. So you see what the celebrating is. It wasn't so much the land deal, but it was the announcement about the wedding. And so the community is already celebrating. And so when you think about why they're rejoicing, well, the kinsman redeemer has done what God had designed for it to do. By the way, do you realize that while that is a doctrine and practice in Jewish life, Ruth is the only record that we have in the Bible that demonstrates to us how this concept of the kinsman redeemer worked. And so they're excited that the kinsman redeemer has redeemed this family from loss. They're rejoicing because Naomi and Ruth, who were in a very vulnerable position. Listen, in that day and age, widows were probably the most vulnerable of all the people in the land. And both were. And Naomi especially, because with her having been up in age and no longer able to give birth, she wasn't really a candidate for a man to be their wife, because they want a woman that is capable of bearing children. And so it's a time of rejoicing. They're also rejoicing because a wedding's going to take place. A marriage is happening. While I was reading this past couple of days, I came across some comments by David Atkinson, a commentator. And here's what he says. I want you to listen to this, because he's got a really good point that we need to rediscover in America. Here's what he says. He says, in Ruth 4:11 and 12, the mood is one of joy, and all the people are involved in the celebration. This is an aspect of marriage which should not be lost. In our day, marriage is coming to be thought of by some as only a private alliance between two people, to be made and even terminated as they wish by their private choice. But now listen to this statement right here. But society has always had an interest in the formation of a new pair bond, or a marriage between a man and a woman, and the growth of a new family unit in society. Despite the very different cultural surroundings, expectancies of marriage, and social relationships between the sexes, the covenant model of marriage, which we can discern in both Old and New Testament, carries with it the fact that marriage is to be understood both in personal and relational terms when we focus on the couple, and in social terms when we stand back from the couple and see their place in the wider social group. In other words, what they're saying is this, that marriage is not something that happens in a vacuum simply between a man and a woman. There's a reason why historically weddings are done publicly, so that the community comes together to witness what is going on. You know, we sometimes say it like this, all right? We sometimes say, as goes the home, so goes the nation. You've heard that before? All right? Well, let me tell you, the reality is it goes deeper than that. Because the marriage between a man and a woman is the foundation of the home. And the real truth is this, that as goes the marriage relationship, so goes the home, and so goes the nation. It doesn't take you very long, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to put the pieces together and to see what's happening in our society, where we are in a place to where there's an initiative going on that I'm getting involved with. It's called the Hamilton County Marriage Initiative. And it's a coalition of pastors coming together to work together to try to help see the divorce rate in Hamilton County begin to decline within 3 years, by 2026, 27. And because when you look at marriage and divorce rates, the reality is there's not a whole lot of difference between what you find among Christians and what you find among non-Christians. And then when you look at many marriages are not healthy marriages. And an unhealthy marriage makes for an unhealthy home. A dysfunctional marriage makes for a dysfunctional home. And a dysfunctional home typically produces dysfunctional children. And then we've gone to the point now to where not only is marriage expendable in that sense, now we've got cohabitation that's going on, rampant. And so you see why the celebration. And we need to rediscover this and understand that if we really want to see our nation healed, one of the things that's going to happen is that the marriage of a man and a woman is going to have to be strengthened and be what God intended for it to be. Because the marriage is really the foundation. If the home is the foundation of society, marriage is the foundation of the home. Then we come to verses 13 through 21, and we see Boaz and Ruth's descendants. It says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son, which is going to be the son that would carry on the name of Mahlon, Ruth's first husband. And then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, a kinsman redeemer. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him.' And then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him." Now you got to stop and really soak in that picture right there. Because you got to go back to chapter 1. When you start out in chapter 1, it doesn't look like there's very much prospect for a scene like this transpiring. And so here's a woman who in many ways was hopeless and broken, bitter to some extent, childless, husbandless, resourceless. And now God has just worked this amazing story and has brought her to the place to where, through her daughter-in-law Ruth, the widow of her son, that now she's holding this child who is a grandchild. It's a beautiful picture. It's a great picture of God's grace. Amen? In verse 17, "And also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, 'There is a son born to Naomi,' and they called him Obed. And he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. But he would carry on the line of Mahlon." Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Amminadab. And Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. And Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. And by the way, those 4 verses we just read, you find every bit of that in both the genealogy of Joseph and of Mary. Joseph's in Matthew, and Mary's in Luke chapter 3. So think about this. Fast forward all the way to the time of the New Testament and what Luke's writing about of Mary and Joseph making their way to Bethlehem. The reason why Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem to register for the census that was being taken by Augustus can be traced back to a widow woman who came from Moab back to Bethlehem and brought her husbandless daughter-in-law with her. And there her daughter-in-law met a man named Boaz, and they married, had a family, which led eventually to the birth of King David, who, by the way, was from Bethlehem, the city of David. And eventually one day the Savior, will be born in Bethlehem. Isn't that amazing? Only God can do that. Only God can do that. Chance, coincidence, don't have a chance for those kinds of things to happen. And so as we conclude, I want you to think about a few things concerning the kinsman redeemer. Pastor David Guzik made some statements here, and I'm going to use what he had to say about this. And so I want you to listen to this. The consideration of Jesus in this book of Ruth doesn't begin with the mention of King David. Jesus has been through the whole book pictured by Boaz and the office of the kinsman redeemer. We typically identify Jesus immediately with David, okay, the son of David. But the picture of Jesus in the book of Ruth is before David's even mentioned, before his birth is even mentioned at the end there in that genealogy. It's pictured by Boaz. So think about this. The kinsman redeemer had to be a family member. Jesus added humanity to his eternal deity so he could be our kinsman and save us. In other words, Jesus, God became flesh, became a man, and when he became a man, he joined the human family so that he could be our kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying family members out of slavery. Jesus redeemed us from the slavery of sin and death. The kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying back land that had been forfeited. Jesus will redeem the earth that mankind sold over to Satan. Boaz, as the kinsman redeemer to Ruth, was not motivated by self-interest, but motivated by love for Ruth. Jesus' motivation for redeeming us is his great love for us. Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, had to have a plan to redeem Ruth unto himself. And some might have thought the plan to be foolish, for what I said earlier. That's the reason why the other kinsman said, no, I'm not going there because I'm going to be losing. Boaz didn't care about that. Some people might have thought what he was doing was foolish. Jesus has a plan to redeem us, and some think his plan is foolish, saving men by a cross. And yet the plan works and is glorious. Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, took her as his bride. The people Jesus has redeemed are collectively called his bride. Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, provided a glorious destiny for Ruth. Jesus, as our redeemer, provides a glorious destiny for us. So maybe you've not been exposed to that concept of the kinsman redeemer in the past. So I hope that this has given us a bit more of an appreciation for the significance of it, that all that Jesus did. See, we talk about Jesus as our Redeemer. That's directly connected to this concept of the idea of the kinsman redeemer. Okay? All right, any questions? All right, we shall conclude. Thank you all online for joining us. Have a blessed evening. Brother Randy?